All right, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into a stack of material centered around the book, The Code Killers, Why DNA and Ionizing Radiation Are a Dangerous Mix by Ace Hoffman.
Yeah, these are the sources you shared, and our goal here is really to explore the core arguments, the key insights presented in this specific material.
Exactly. Pulling out those important nuggets of knowledge for you, the listener.
And we should say up front, this source definitely positions itself as a critical look, really an expose of the nuclear industry. It takes a very clear stance from the beginning.
Absolutely. So we want to be clear. We're exploring this viewpoint, the one laid out by the author, Mr. Hoffman. He calls himself a citizen, not an activist.
Right. Our job isn't to endorse it, but to understand what he's saying, presenting the content and the claims impartially for you to consider.
Okay, so get ready. This deep dive promises some, well, pretty powerful, maybe even surprising claims about radiation, DNA, nuclear waste, the whole industry, really.
All seen through the specific lens of this book. So let's jump in with what the author sees as the fundamental problem.
The core idea driving the code killers.
It's exactly what the title says. Ionizing radiation and DNA are fundamentally a dangerous mix.
Okay, so why? Why is that the starting point, the central concern for this author?
Well, the book explains it's really about energy. Ionizing radiation carries enough energy to actually break the chemical bonds holding molecules together.
And crucially, it can directly damage DNA.
Exactly. If you think of DNA as like the instruction manual, the code for life in our cells, damaging that code messes everything up.
Cell function goes haywire, you get mutations.
Yeah, and the author links this directly to serious health problems, especially cancer.
So it's not just any energy, it's a specific type of radiation with this bond-breaking power.
Precisely. The source mentions types like alpha, beta, gamma radiation. What makes them ionizing is that ability to knock electrons off atoms, creating ions.
Oh, yeah.
And that process is the mechanism that lets them slice through those biological bonds in DNA and other critical molecules. It's that disruptive power at the atomic level. That's the concern.
And the book talks about measuring this potential damage, right? Using units, sieverts, Rem.
Yes, those units are about dose the amount absorbed, but importantly, they're weighted. They try to reflect the biological effect of different types of radiation.
So it's the scientific language for quantifying potential harm.
Right, from this kind of exposure.
Okay, so the fundamental science, as presented by the author, points to this direct danger to our genes. But then the book argues this isn't just theoretical. It's present in our lives.
Right. The author presents this idea that radiation is, well, way more pervasive than many people might realize. The book includes diagrams showing sources of exposure, breaking it down.
What does that breakdown look like, according to this source?
Well, it shows a big chunk is natural stuff we can't really avoid, like radon gas from the ground, cosmic rays.
Even stuff in our own bodies.
Yeah, naturally occurring radioactive isotopes. Then it shows manufactured sources making up a smaller but still significant slice. Medical X-rays are a big part of that category, according to the diagram.
And there's that diagram showing pathways to ingestion. What's the point there?
That's key. It's about how radioactive materials, once they get out into the environment, maybe from an industrial process, don't just stay out there.
They get inside us.
Exactly. The diagram shows how they can settle from the air, we can breathe them in, eat or drink contaminated stuff.
Or they get taken up by plants and animals we eat.
Right. It demonstrates how these dangerous substances can become internal radiation sources.
Okay, getting inside the body. That leads right into another key concept the author highlights. Half-life. Sounds simple, but the book makes an important distinction.
It really does. Radioactive half-life, that's basic physics, you know, the time for half the atoms in a substance to decay.
But the author stresses that the biological half-life is different.
Totally different, and often more relevant for health, according to the argument here.
And the difference is?
Well, a substance might decay relatively fast, radiologically speaking, but if your body absorbs it and hangs onto it, if it has a long biological half-life...
It just keeps radiating you from the inside.
Exactly. That internal, ongoing irradiation is the author's major concern, causing damage day after day, potentially.
The tritium example in the book illustrates this, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Tritium's radiological half-life is about 12.3 years, but the book points out that while most of it acts like water and leaves the body fairly quickly,
Some gets incorporated.
a tiny fraction potentially can get built into organic molecules. The author notes even about 1/1,000,000th of the initial amount might stick around after many radiological half-lives, still irradiating cells from within.
So it's the lingering biological presence that extends the exposure, even if the stuff itself is decaying.
That's the argument. A powerful point, something inside you for a long time. Okay, so moving from the science to the system, the book takes a very critical stance on the nuclear industry itself.
Yeah, it pulls no punches. The author portrays it as dangerous, accident-prone, maybe deceptive.
And driven more by profit than safety. There's this strong theme throughout the book suggesting the industry is in denial about the real risks.
And there's that pretty striking claim the author includes about regulatory oversight.
Yes, the book references what seems to be a statement from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC. It quotes something like, "Statements made by the public affairs officers of a NRC licensee are not regulated activities.
Really?
Therefore, the veracity of such statements will not be investigated by the NRC." The author uses this as evidence of a major gap in accountability.
Suggesting the industry's PR isn't checked for truthfulness by the regulators.
That's how it's presented, yeah.
Yeah.
As a potentially big blind spot in the oversight system.
Wow. Okay. Let's walk through the basic nuclear process as the book describes it.
The author outlines the whole cycle. Starts with mining uranium.
Then enrichment, making fuel rods.
Right. Operating the reactors, dealing with the spent fuel, and then storage. The point made is that radiation is an inherent dangerous byproduct at every single step.
And it briefly touches on nuclear fission itself.
That's the core reaction in the reactor, right? Splitting heavy atoms, usually uranium-235, releases huge energy, but also neutrons, gamma rays.
And all those radioactive fission products, that's the source of a lot of the concern here.
Exactly. The book also mentions the two main reactor types, BWRs and PWRs.
Boiling water and pressurized water reactors.
Yeah, it diagrams them, shows the technical differences in cooling and steam generation, but the implication is clear. Whatever the design, they make dangerous radiation and this huge waste problem.
Speaking of dangers, a big chunk of the book highlights past accidents and near misses.
Yeah, this section really serves to illustrate the author's argument about the potential for catastrophe and the reality of large radiation releases.
The book explains what a meltdown is first.
Essentially, the reactor core overheating so much it melts, which risks breaching containment and releasing massive amounts of radioactive
And specific historical incidents are recounted. 3 Mile Island?
1979. The author calls it a partial core melt, citing an estimated 15 million curies released, though noting official numbers were lower.
It includes accounts of health effects.
Yeah, reports of birds dying, people with ear, nose, throat issues. It also references criticism from people like Richard Webb about the official radiation monitoring.
Then, of course, Chernobyl.
The 1986 disaster in Ukraine. Devastating. The author describes the explosion, the graphite fire, estimates a staggering 10 billion curies released.
And the long-term health impacts.
Especially thyroid cancer are emphasized. The area is described as one of the most polluted places on Earth because of it.
What about Davis-Besse? That one's maybe less known.
Presented as a near meltdown in 2002 in Ohio, the author points to really bad corrosion that ate through most of the steel reactor vessel head.
Undetected or unaddressed.
The argument is it likely developed over years, highlighting risks from aging plants and potentially inadequate inspection as the author sees it.
And there's mention of Kishtim.
The book refers to a 1957 disaster in Russia, Kishtim, calling it the world's worst nuclear accident based on the author's sources. Claims millions poisoned, huge area contaminated. It's on the timeline of incidents presented.
The book also mentions risk studies, like CRTU, but seems skeptical.
Yeah, it seems to argue that while those probabilistic studies exist, the actual track record, including these incidents, suggests the real risk of a major accident might be higher than the models predict.
Okay, so the science is presented as concerning, the industry and regulation criticized, major accidents highlighted, but what really comes across as maybe the biggest, most stubborn problem in the book is the waste.
Absolutely, nuclear waste. The author focuses heavily on this, even calling it, with some grim irony, your gift to tomorrow.
And the current storage methods are described as particularly problematic.
Sympant fuel pools, specifically, described as often overcrowded, holding way more radioactive fuel than the reactor core itself, like 30 to 40 times more, the book says.
And vulnerable.
Portrayed as highly vulnerable to fires, steam explosions, a situation the author finds really alarming.
What about the dry cask storage that's used more now?
Equally critical, it seems. Described as expensive, needing lots of space, and presented as definitely not a long-term solution.
Still vulnerable to events or security threats.
That's the suggestion. The author's view seems summarized as, this method is also deeply unsafe.
The book uses a really stark comparison for the toxicity.
It's a powerful image, yeah. Intended to drive the point home, states something like, 1 pint of many of these fission products is a deadly dose, and half a beer can hold hundreds of billions of lethal doses.
Just emphasizing the extreme danger packed into that spent fuel.
Right. And the financial burden of managing it is also hit hard.
Yeah, the book mentions the huge sums committed to the waste fund, tens of billions, with billions already spent, underscoring the ongoing cost, even without accidents. So the author's conclusion here seems pretty definitive, based on the material presented.
The strong assertion made in the book is, there is no safe, cost-effective storage or transportation solution currently available for this waste.
Okay. Beyond the immediate, obvious damage from high doses, the book also gets into more subtle, hidden ways radiation can cause harm over time.
Right. This is where the author explores damage that might not show up right away, but contributes to long-term health issues.
Things like inflammation, or this idea of leftover recoil damage.
Yeah, describing lingering disruption in cells even after the initial hit. The book also discusses hot particles.
Microscopic radioactive bits.
Yeah, tiny, highly radioactive particles. If inhaled or ingested, they can lodge in tissue and just sit there, irradiating a small area continuously for potentially thousands, even billions of years, causes localized, ongoing damage.
And the bystander effect. What's that?
That's the phenomenon where cells not directly hit by radiation can still show damage or changes because they receive signals or molecules from nearby cells that were hit.
So the damage kind of spreads.
Yeah, beyond the initial point of impact.
Free radical syndrome is another concept mentioned.
Right. Radiation can trigger a cascade of these highly reactive chemicals called free radicals inside cells.
And they just damage things randomly.
Pretty much. DNA, proteins, other cell parts, they contribute to oxidative stress and, the book argues, disease.
And mitochondrial DNA gets a specific mention.
Yeah, mtDNA, the DNA outside the cell nucleus. It's highlighted because it's mostly inherited from the mother and might be more vulnerable or less easily repaired than nuclear DNA.
So another pathway for radiation damage with potential generational effects, according to the author.
Right. And all these hidden effects, as the book describes them, circle back to that central argument about DNA damage.
Exactly. The author links this DNA damage directly to cancer, starting defining cancer as basically a mutation of a single individual's unique DNA.
And points to connections with other serious issues, too. Cardiovascular, neurological problems mentioned.
The focus on fundamental DNA damage seems to support the idea running through the book that even low levels of radiation carry risk.
It does imply that. It aligns with the concept that there might be no truly safe dose, what's often called the linear no threshold, or LNT model, meaning any exposure, theoretically, could increase risk.
And it seems the book argues a lot of this isn't widely acknowledged, especially by the industry or regulators.
That's where the author really emphasizes the role of whistleblowers.
Presented as crucial.
Yeah, as people who felt they had to share critical information, the knowledge that they believed was being suppressed or ignored by those in charge. It's all about the knowledge, the author states. Access to truthful information is key.
And the book names specific individuals.
Yes, several people are mentioned, their stories briefly told. Carl Z. Morgan, called the father of health physics, who apparently raised early concerns about independent safety evaluations.
That's a Sharani.
An inspector who claimed his reports on substandard parts were dismissed, leading him to leave the industry. Jack Shannon reported widespread fraud at a major contractor.
Doug Roque.
A retired major who claims he faced retaliation for sharing info on the health effects of uranium weapons. And Richard Webb, the doctor whose findings apparently contradicted official reports on 3 Mile Island radiation releases.
The book even mentions early warnings, like from Szilard and Einstein.
That's included in the historical context, yeah. presenting even some key figures in atomic energy development as having voiced early concerns to President Roosevelt about the potential dangers.
Given this strong critique of nuclear power throughout the book, it's probably no surprise the author strongly pushes for alternatives.
Yeah, that section's titled very directly. There are plenty of alternatives to nuclear energy. The author makes a clear case.
What kind of alternatives does the book highlight?
Things like wind, biomass, solar, hydro, geothermal, tidal power are all listed.
And presented how?
As cleaner, inherently safer, widely available, and ultimately cheaper, especially when you factor in those huge, unresolved costs of nuclear waste and potential accidents.
The author's message seems to be that America can choose these alternatives, basically all of the above.
It's definitely presented as a viable, positive way forward, suggesting the technology and resources are there to transition away from nuclear power completely.
Which brings us back to cost, not just dollars, but broader impact.
The book revisits the financial side, arguing nuclear plants are just too expensive without major government subsidies. Gives examples of high costs for specific utilities.
And connects that financial cost to health costs.
Yes, the author includes info like a chart comparing cancer treatment costs to emphasize the huge financial toll of illnesses linked, in the book's view, to radiation exposure.
And beyond money.
The author talks about the wider societal burden, lost productivity, lost great people, lost great ideas, suggesting the impacts ripple out quite broadly.
So having laid out all these concerns, critiques, the book finishes with a call to action. Suggestions for individuals.
Right, it provides specific lists, suggested next steps you can take today, and how can I protect myself and my family.
What kind of actions are suggested?
It's a mix. Political stuff like writing to Congress, demanding politicians read the book. Public awareness things like sharing the book, writing letters to editors, urging media divestment from nuclear interests.
Joining groups, seeking reparations.
Also mentioned, joining or forming organizations, pursuing reparations for victims. The overall message is one of persistence. Never give up.
And what about personal protection tips?
Suggestions like avoiding living or working near nuclear plants. The author uses that phrase, don't work for the demon hot atom.
Wow.
Other tips include choosing non-radioactive options when possible, like certain smoke detectors, minimizing unnecessary medical x-rays, maybe getting a personal radiation detector, taking antioxidants, and working to change laws.
There's also that stark point about insurance coverage.
Yes, a section titled, At Least I'm Insured, right? The author states flatly that standard insurance policies universally exclude coverage for nuclear accidents.
Presented as evidence the public bears the ultimate financial risk.
That seems to be the point, not the industry, not the insurers.
So, that's our deep dive into the material from the Code Killers. We've explored Ace Hoffman's perspective, his arguments about radiation and DNA,
his detailed criticisms of the industry, the regulation, the huge problem of waste, the whistleblowers highlighted, the alternatives strongly pushed.
And finally, the steps the author suggests individuals can take.
Right. This has really been about understanding this specific viewpoint presented in the sources you shared with us, a viewpoint that's clearly critical, aiming to expose perceived dangers.
And we've done our best to just impartially report on the content, the claims, the arguments made within this particular book.
And as we wrap up, one theme that really echoes through the book, especially on nuclear waste, is just the sheer timescale involved.
Thousands of years of hazard. The author stresses that repeatedly.
It really forces you to think about long-term responsibility on an almost unimaginable scale, doesn't it? What does it truly mean for something we create today to need safe, secure management for millennia?
Stretching into the deep, deep future. What does that level of enduring responsibility look like for us, especially considering the challenges and criticisms of current approaches that this source lays out?
Yeah, that's definitely something we're thinking about.